thing that our audience continues to be interested in is neuroscience in particular.
Yeah.
People are geeking out on neuroscience.
It's fun to see.
So we should talk about neuroscience in particular and how it relates to the work being done at MindMed and your background's in pharmacology.
I spent about 10 years as chief operating officer of a clinical stage pharmaceutical company. And part of that was driven by exactly that, my interest in drugs and how they work, and particular interest on how drugs behave in the body, how they interact, how they're cleared, all of the kind of nuts and bolts of how drugs interface with the body and how they behave, and what they do in humans in particular, and what that translates to in terms of positive clinical outcomes. That's my big passion and interest in professionally in life. And I think this is an area of great interest because it is so fascinating, all of the aspects that are relevant to psychedelics in terms of how they behave, what they do, and really untangling a lot of this. I'm not a neuroscientist by any means, so I can't get but so deep in terms of hardcore neuroscience. But what I can say is that the activity of these molecules is unique. We don't fully understand it. There's so much work that has been done, is still being done to try to characterize it. And I have so many friends and colleagues in this field who are doing really very impressive scientific inquiry into how these drugs behave. It's going to be really a lot of learning that we get over the next few years. But at this point, we really don't know, right? We don't know how psychedelics exactly work. There's a lot of assumptions. There's a lot of assumptions around the causative nature of the acute effects. And we as an organization, and myself personally, we're okay with not fully knowing. And the important thing here is we keep a patient orientation. How do we dose patients and make them better? That's our core goal. We prove the safety and effectiveness of the drugs we work on, and we get an approval. And so it is, there's so, you couldn't cover it in probably an entire day of all the neuroscience that's been going on with psychedelics over the past several decades. But it's an incredibly exciting field, I know, for everyone. I've had some really almost above anyone's head, I think, conversations about other levels of inquiry. One of the research, I'm based in Madison, Wisconsin. One of the researchers here, Giulio Tononi, has theories of consciousness, not psychedelic, just theories of consciousness that he thinks psychedelics could play an important role in deciphering. And so there's just a fascinating body that all ends up being connected back into the psychedelic research and the neuroscience research that's happening today.
Yeah, well, I think that's why there's so much ready crossover into psychedelic culture and psychedelic art and psychedelic philosophy, because it's really about existence, right? There's like a core existentialist component to all of this curiosity. And I would imagine, you're setting up clinical trials on the regular. That's what you organize, and you talk about administration of compounds and substances, and then evaluating and monitoring and getting the feedback and putting that information together. It's a big part of what you're doing.
That's exactly right. I mean, everything we do is constructed of how you would develop normal drugs. And I think one of the things about MindMed, and really when I came into the organization, one of the visions we have is that in order to deliver on the full potential of this drug class, we're a drug development organization. We're a pharma organization. We have everyone on our team comes from pharma industry and knows how to do trials well, because there's so much research happening, again, thinking about mechanistic understanding and potential applications. But at the end of the day, we need drugs that get approved and can actually get to patients. And in order to deliver on that, you need to know how the game's played, how to get those drugs as efficiently as possible across the finish line. And then really one of the beauties of our industry and as a pharmaceutical company is that we're somewhat tool makers, and everyone in parallel is understanding how the tools work, and they're understanding potential ways to optimize patient outcomes in a real world setting. All of that happens in conjunction, and then it ultimately culminates in getting a new tool, a new drug approved and out to providers. If we can play that function, then it really unleashes a whole field and many subsequent generations of research on how they can be used even more extensively, how they can be adapted and optimized, and how ultimately how patient outcomes can be amplified and improved to the greatest extent possible.
Is there a concern within the pharmaceutical industry about, because it just from a jaded point of view and conversations that come up around me all the time, what does big pharma care about having a medication that could lessen the dependency as opposed to a maintenance drug that's going to demand constant dependency?
What I can say just from experience, both in our sector, but also in the pharmaceutical industry more broadly, is that I've never come across particularly a researcher, someone who's working to develop new therapies, who isn't in it because they are wholly intent on making patients better. Now, drugs have different advantages and liabilities, and no drug is all good or all bad. This is just a simple fact. There's a risk-benefit equation that gets. This is a regulatory point, but also one in terms of the broader medical community, in the sense that everything has a risk and a benefit associated with it in some respect. And water has a risk. If you drink too much water, you can suffer from it. Certainly there are instances of bad actors, and those bad actors are often over an extended time period held to account. But any drugs that are used chronically, again, there's benefits and there's risks associated with it. The drugs that are available to us, SSRIs, psychotropic drugs that are on the market today, I think it should be very clear, help far more people than they hurt. There's so many people who have benefited from the use of antidepressants and other CNS active drugs over the last decades. I think it's a bit kind of reductive to think of them solely as good or bad. What we do know is that they're not good enough, and they do have safety liabilities, and they're not good enough for enough patients in our minds. And so to bring new tools to market, again, we as an industry are tool makers. Providers are there to actually they have the craft of using those tools to help and deliver care to patients. That's a clear distinction that it often gets muddled in the psychedelic world too. But we as an industry are there to get products to market and demonstrate the safety and effectiveness of those products. I certainly, and we as an organization, keep the patients at the forefront of our mind. We want to bring these tools in the best way possible so they're as widely accessible and usable as they can be, so that we can help patients get better. And I think when you zoom out and you look at the pharmaceutical industry more generally, that is true in far more cases than it's not.
It seems like there's more discussion now when we talk about how psychedelic medicines are going to work once they're available on a wide scale and legally. It seems like there's more discussion of the integration of therapy and of community or communication. Is it safe to say that there's a different consideration now for auxiliary tools to go into pursuing health and wellness to treat mental health conditions, specifically with regard to psychotherapy? And what does it look like on the pharmaceutical side to consider how does this product get rolled out in addition to this whole other regimen of care?
Yeah, I think that the core of the issue, again, is how do you maximize patient well-being, patient outcomes, right? That's what we and medicine more generally are ultimately all about. The question does start to come in, though, of where those lines get drawn, and what is the purview of a organization developing new pharmaceutical products and seeking their approval versus medicine. In this context, so we know that psychotherapy plus drugs works better than drugs alone. No matter no matter if it's antidepressants, likely going to be the case with psychedelics, simply because they're additive. You're going to get more benefit from having more treatments. In this case, when you're talking about pharmacotherapy and psychotherapy in tandem. The question that hasn't been answered, and that really is critically important to answer, is whether psychotherapy is an essential component of separation from a placebo, for instance, right? It's also often conflated in terms of what is the objective of a clinical research program and a drug approval versus what is the ultimate goal of getting these drugs approved and getting them to patients. While again, our guiding light is maximizing patient outcomes, it can't be lost on us that really the evidence standard we are held to in terms of getting drugs approved on the market and out to patients is to demonstrate the safety and effectiveness of a drug. And there's actually some constraints in terms of regulations and what can be put onto drug labels. So an example I like to use all the time is that of Vivitrol, which is approved for alcohol use disorder. Very similar to psychedelics, Vivitrol in its development program, there was a prescriptive manual-based counseling program that had to be administered alongside of naltrexone in development. When the drug ultimately got approved, the label says patients should be enrolled in a comprehensive management program that includes psychosocial support. And that starts to show you the constraints and the limits of what is psychotherapy in the practice of medicine versus what is a drug effect and what can go on a drug label and what can be enforced. It's fantastic that the conversation has moved in a direction where now we're talking about both of these, and ultimately the conversation always ends up in that same guiding light of ours, which is let's figure out all the tools and provide those tools to support patient outcomes, to make patients as best off as possible. We think about these as interlinking but parallel kind of development efforts, where we need to take drugs towards an approval, and we need to support and enhance psychotherapy and try to use all the tools that we can support and develop and roll out in the world to maximize those patient outcomes in the long run.
One thing we continue to talk about is access to care, and how a lot of mental health disorders seem to scale to socioeconomic factors. What kind of conversations have you had with peers and other innovators in this space about how to make cutting edge treatments after the results show that they're highly effective and very promising? How do we make this available to more people? Because oftentimes we consider psychotherapy or counseling or, whatever we're doing to augment our mental health through the use of a professional like a psychologist or a licensed clinical social worker, that can be seen as an extravagance, something that people don't often, you might have dental health insurance, but as we know, coverage for mental health is pretty woeful for most people, and the insurance coverage they receive through jobs or they source on their own. So what kind of discussions have you had with peers and other innovators about making access to the whole picture of care accessible to the greatest number of people for the greatest wellness?
It's a really important issue, right? And accessibility and ultimately the scale of impact that we can have with these therapies, right? It would be a tragedy if we do all of the hard work over many years to get these drugs to market and they can't get to anyone because no one can afford them, or because there hasn't been the infrastructure laid to be ready to receive them effectively. In terms of how we maximize access to drugs, but also psychotherapy, again, there are so many stakeholders in that discussion, and our purview really isn't psychotherapy reimbursement unless it is an essential component of drug delivery. That said, it also kind of dovetails nicely with the discussion we were just having, which is to say that I actually think it's a disservice in terms of access and reach of this drug class if we are overly constrictive in terms of clinical research and the psychotherapy and the level of psychotherapy that we require and mandate alongside it, right? If a drug, let's just use an example, say that LSD alone without any psychotherapy improves anxiety scores by 40%, but it improves and that effect is durable for a year. But with psychotherapy or with good psychotherapy, it increases to 60%. This is just all made up numbers. But in that instance, yes, the best magnitude of impact comes from drug plus psychotherapy. We know this. This is the case from SSRIs. But we think it would be a disservice to then only allow access when you can have a drug reimbursement plus a very expensive, highly degreed level of psychotherapy alongside it. It's actually more aligned with access and scale if you can demonstrate the safety and effectiveness without, a psychoanalyst, and if you live in New York and you're well off and you're of a high socioeconomic class, you can likely afford $1,000 an hour psychotherapy alongside a drug treatment. most patients can't. And so to require that level or an extensive degree and level of psychotherapy alongside a drug, actually, I think does a disservice to the potential accessibility and scale of the impact we can ultimately have.
How open is the DEA to answering questions and communicating with people like yourself who are innovating with these substances? You know, from an outsider, from a layperson's point of view, it seems like the DEA more or less is just still stuck in the idea that psychedelics are bad, or that it's, you have to sell somebody on the idea of there being medicinal value, or whatever, however the language is actually phrased.
I wouldn't want to speak for DEA, but certainly my experience with them is that they have been very open. They have been very objective and treated this like they would any other set of drugs that are being researched for positive clinical use. It's important to remember that Drug Enforcement Administration is exactly that. It's an administrative arm. It is not Congress. It doesn't, I mean, it sets policies and enforcement, but it doesn't set the law, right? The Scheduled Controlled Substance Act, that was an act of Congress. And certainly there's a legislative process and acts of Congress that could change the Controlled Substance Act. The DEA, in all of my experience with them, have been very open and I think, frankly, as supportive as we could ask for. Now, there is a layer of administrative hurdles that have to be overcome, whether it's international shipments or interstate shipments, or the licenses and requirements and the sequencing of those that have to be in place in order to actually conduct research with these molecules. They're all there to ensure safety, to minimize diversion, to make sure that we have as tight of controls as required by the law. So while this is one of the other great things about our organization and the incredible talent we've been able to recruit, is that once you know how to navigate that and how to effectively work with and through these regulations and work with DEA, it's a very well-defined process. It takes time. It's an additional set of documents and applications, and this is sort of standard when you interface with the government. But certainly, I've not experienced anything that is short of objective and I wouldn't say supportive, but treating this objectively. And I haven't come across any sort of negative connotation, or really, there's been a curiosity from DEA about the excitement around the field, around the research, and I've even had the experience of a DEA agent saying, well, it's incredible if these drugs can be proven to be effective, if they can help people with mental health conditions, that'd be fantastic, right? I think that DEA and sometimes FDA get a reputation that isn't aligned with how we experience day to day, and we look at these as our colleagues, and very positively the engagements we've had with the agency so far.
When we talk about mental health and people talk about rising instances of depression, anxiety, we talk about the opioid crisis, we're talking about some abstract concepts here. We're talking about neurology and neuroscience, but we're also talking about some fairly abstract concepts, the notion of happiness or wellness. And, what is the baseline supposed to be? What is the baseline supposed to be for wellness, in your opinion, Rob? Like, what is an average person's expectation of agency in their own lives, of happiness, of the ability to facilitate conversations and make decisions? Like, it's this immensely abstract concept, isn't it? Or is it not? Is it really more quantifiable than I understand?
To give it a shot, categorically, I'd say, for people to be able to engage in their lives and their communities and with other individuals and find meaning and value and be able to live the lives that they desire without being confined by or limited in their daily lives and mental status by conditions like anxiety and depression. And these are symptoms. They're also quantified into a disease, into a disorder in the DSM, but anxiety and depression are there outside of a formal diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder or of major depressive disorder or treatment-resistant depression. So I don't know that there's a concept of having arrived at being not these are on a spectrum, and they're going, anxiety, depression, they wax and wane, but when they become imposing in such a way that it limits function, it limits the ability to engage in life, that's when it really becomes something that we focus on, which is treating a disorder, a state that has been medically defined as something that seems to need intervention for the patient's well-being and their overall psychological and physiological status.
So tell me what's lighting you up right now about what MindMed is doing. What are you most excited about when you come into the facility? What's got you thinking? What's got you inspired?
We're incredibly excited to get underway. We've got the study we mentioned before in a few weeks' time, the LSD and anxiety study from our colleagues in Switzerland that's going to be reading out. We're in this quarter, we're also going to be really aggressively moving forward with our LSD study and generalized anxiety disorder, and in the middle of the year dosing our first patients in that study. We also, in the very near term, have a readout that's coming from a phase 1 study that we've conducted with our MM110, or it used to be called 18MC program. So we've got a lot of near-term value drivers, catalysts, things we're excited to get out into the world and really be able to talk fully about. We're also launching these new studies. In the second quarter, we're going to be launching our phase 2 study of MM110 in opioid withdrawal. That will be a really important study for us to demonstrate. This is a molecule that's been researched. It's a non-hallucinogenic analog of ibogaine, and it's been researched for several decades now. It was selected as the best analog of ibogaine to take forward, and preclinically in all the animal models we have, it looks remarkably effective. We're now going to get into the patient population and show for the first time if indeed that translates into humans. And we talk about brain, we use the term brain health disorders, right? Because it's more encompassing than what's typically thought of as just mental health. It's not just anxiety, depression. There's sort of a triangle of affective disorders like anxiety, depression, opioid crisis, substance use, and pain. So we're also moving forward with a program to study LSD in chronic pain, where there's some interesting historical evidence as well. So this year, the past year has been really about organizational building. We've had incredible talent joining MindMed. We've built out the infrastructure. We uplisted the NASDAQ and have all of the US biotech infrastructure in place now. Now we are laser focused on execution. We're getting into our phase 2 clinical programs. In the next 12, 18 months, are going to have a lot of meaningful clinical readouts. That's what gets us going. That's what ultimately catalyzes our organization and the field more broadly to get these products one step closer to market. So it is drug development is always a marathon, but we're running at a very fast pace, and we're really happy to be getting fully underway.